Hello. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about assessment of learning. Now, you might think that assessment is not a very exciting topic, but I'm going to give you several different ways to look at assessment. Assessment is learning how well the students perform on a set of instructional criteria. The primary function of the assessment should be to improve the teaching process. If we can see that the students are not doing well in a particular area of the course, that can be shown through an assessment and the teaching process can be changed. Today's assessments, though, have certainly taken on a whole new meaning. When standardized tests became a part of education, we now are more interested, it seems, in comparing one school to another, or one group of students, one classroom of students, with another teacher's classroom of students. Even placement of students and credentialing is based, all of a sudden, on standardized tests. The term assessment is synonymous with evaluation and also with measurement. But if we look at much of the research that's done on assessment, these terms suddenly have a slightly different meaning, really. Some researchers have pointed out that evaluation is more of a comparison of students or groups of students, like I said a minute ago, classrooms of different students, rather than determining how much the student has learned. Assessment involves assigning a quantitative value to the extent of learning. Assessment, though, doesn't need to be a written test. It can include observations, responses to surveys, work in a discussion group, and we're going to be talking more about different kinds of assessments in this lecture. Assessment of student learning doesn't happen once the class has started. That assessment criteria has to be developed in the instructional design period. The learning outcomes are derived and then they are developed into the assessment that needs to be given to students. So first we have to know what is the student going to learn, and then we have to decide what kind of assessment might be best. When a designer is thinking about the learning outcomes, they need to determine also within that class how that assessment is going to take place. For example, if the students are only going to do recall of factual information, then certainly a paper pencil test is a good way to assess that. But if you're trying to assess how well a student can bake chocolate chip cookies, probably the paper pencil test is not the best way to go. In order for the teaching and the learning outcomes to be deliberate and purposeful, then those objectives need to be stated clearly to the students. These are usually stated in the syllabus, and then once the students understand what they're going to get from this class, then they need to make sure that the assignments that they're writing match with those learning outcomes. And that's another thing that instructional designers do, is they try to match the outcomes with what the assignments are, with what the assessments are. So it's really a three-way process. So let's look at two kinds of assessment. And the first one is called summative assessment. And maybe you've heard that term before, but I'm going to explain it to you a little bit better. Summative assessment often happens at the end of a course. You may be asked to fill out a course evaluation, or you may be asked to produce some kind of a product. Well, this provides information on the student's experience, the learning experience within the course, but it doesn't really tell us the degree of learning that has taken place. Many educators don't find summative assessments to be very useful to teaching and learning because summative tests only reflect what skills the student has gained at the end of the course. Sometimes they give information on the student's feeling about the course or feeling towards the instructor's qualifications. The next term you've probably heard of, and that is formative evaluation. And this type of evaluation can occur at the end of the course, although it's better if it continues throughout the course as those learning objectives are being met. It can be a quiz. It can be a simple observation of the students in action, baking those chocolate chip cookies. The formative evaluation is focused on the actual learning experience that led or did not lead to accomplishment of the learning outcome. Findings from the formative evaluation often lead us to just-in-time adjustments. So if an instructor sees that students are not learning the content that needs to be done for that learning objectives, that teaching process can suddenly be changed to make sure that that learning starts to occur. This type of assessment is linked to course content and provides detailed information on the specific learning that each individual is having. There are several different kinds of formative evaluations that we can use, especially in online education. So let me explain some of those to you. In online education, we certainly have the opportunity for computer-based assessment. But the issue is we don't know for sure who is sitting in front of the computer hundreds of miles or thousands of miles away from the instructor. Who's taking the test? So there are authentication software packages that some universities are starting to use. The problem with those is that they can be difficult and cumbersome for the student, and they can be quite expensive for the university that's trying to use them. If you look at the banking industry, they really are going to be the forerunners for authentication. But let's get back to talking about assessing in an online environment. Remember, too, that objective tests allow only for the recall of facts with little interpretation. So as students really don't get to use critical thinking skills, they don't get to give an interpretation of what they've learned and how it applied to their past knowledge. These types of tests offer a question bank also that the instructor builds themselves, or sometimes the textbook publisher offers those. These test question banks contain hundreds, sometimes even thousands of questions. So each student that takes that particular formative assessment gets a slightly different test on the same content. This helps in a way with alleviating some of the cheating, meaning that students can't save the questions from week to week or can't email them to a friend, or they have to be doing their own work. So that can be important. But although standardized tests remain popular for use in student selection and student placement, primarily because of their reliability and validity. These tests, though, I feel, are out of tune with the technology and the constructivism that is being used in classrooms today. The tests, yes, are proven, they are reliable, they are valid, and we can assign a quantitative value to the amount that student has learned. But I'm not sure that's totally what we want to have happen. Okay, let's step away from a moment from those computer-based or computer-generated tests or paper pencil kinds of tests. Performance assessment can give us another option for testing students. And this is one that I see happening more and more often, especially in online classes. And this performance assessment is a formative kind of assessment, but it allows for observation. So as I gave you the example of students learning to bake chocolate chip cookies, being able to write the ingredients and answer true-false questions doesn't really show me as the instructor that they can go and bake a cookie. But what I can do is ask them to set up a video using their phone, using their computer, and go through the steps to create the cookie. And in that way, I can use a rubric to offer them points for each part of the steps that they're taking, for listing the ingredients, for knowing how to mix it, or whatever else there might be. So a performance assessment is a way for an instructor to observe the knowledge that the student has gained. You may have a video in this class. Another form of formative assessment that you see often, I'm sure, in online classes, and that is interaction. So you may be asked to perform or participate in a discussion group or a forum. Possibly you're supposed to answer 2 people per week plus post your own assignment. So those assignments, those interactions can add points. They can show that you are learning or that your students are understanding the material that's being presented in the class. I find that this type of interaction as an assessment tool allows me as the instructor to observe and to make sure that the knowledge I want my students to gain is really happening. I can help to verify that information and correct any mistakes or any mistaken interpretations that may be taking place. So this is another good way to assess the learning. If you were going to define assessment, after listening to this lecture, I hope that you would say it really is a verification of what the student has learned and have they been able to understand and show through assignments or through interaction that they have accomplished the learning outcomes. So keep in mind that those things go together. It all begins with the instructional design. It begins with the learning objectives, and then it looks at the assignments, and then finally the overall picture of what learning has taken place. And I hope as you're reading this week, you'll look at other ways to assess learning, especially in the online environment. Again, it's not all about paper pencil. It's about observing the learning and making sure that the students have the right concepts and they've covered those learning outcomes.